Welcome to today's video. We're diving into the infamous Scholar's Mate, a sneaky trap that catches many beginners. Stick around to learn how to crush this opening and take control of the game from move 1. Let's get started. The Scholar's Mate usually begins with the moves pawn to e4, followed by pawn to e5. White will then play a very aggressive second move, queen to h5. The purpose of this queen to h5 move is twofold. White is threatening to capture the pawn on e5 with check, and also setting up the classic 4-move checkmate with queen, takes pawn on f7 after playing bishop to c4 on the next turn. Now let's look at a few moves that black needs to be very cautious about. Many beginners who are unfamiliar with how to defend against this line may respond with pawn to g6, trying to attack the white queen. However, this is a serious blunder. White can simply play queen takes pawn on e5, delivering a check. On the next move, white will capture the rook, and the game is practically over in just 4 moves, since black is already a whole rook down. Another move you might consider is knight to f6, trying to threaten the white queen and force it to retreat. But this is also a small mistake, because white can again play queen takes pawn on e5 with check, gaining a free pawn. A better response is knight to c6, which defends the pawn on e5. In fact, knight to c6 is the best move in this position. White will then continue with bishop to c4, setting up the Scholar's Mate, also known as the 4-move checkmate, by threatening queen, takes pawn on f7, which would be checkmate on the next move. All you have to do here is defend against your opponent's threats. The threat is very clear. White wants to capture the pawn on f7 with the queen on the next move. So, our goal is simple. Either block the queen from capturing our pawn, or defend the pawn on f7 with another piece. Most beginners make the mistake of playing knight to f6, trying to chase the queen away, but this is a major blunder because it allows checkmate in just one move. Instead of playing knight to f6, you could consider queen to e7 or queen to f6, as both moves protect the pawn on f7. However, in this video, we won't recommend either of these queen moves. Why? Because placing the queen on f6 blocks the knight from developing naturally, and placing the queen on e7 blocks the bishop from developing in future moves. That's why we recommend the best move in this position, pawn to g6. This move attacks the queen and also prevents the immediate threat of queen, takes pawn on f7. However, white may try to continue the attack by retreating the queen to f3, once again threatening queen takes pawn on f7 checkmate. At this point, you must be careful once again. Your job is to either block the threat or defend the f7 square. Make sure not to play a careless move like knight to d4. While it might seem tempting, since it attacks the queen and also appears to threaten a check and a fork on the rook on a1, it completely ignores white's threat and still allows checkmate on the next move. But we still need to be careful. Our pawn on f7 is still under attack. So the best thing to do here is to continue developing naturally with knight to f6, which defends the pawn on f7 and blocks the threat. Now, white needs to respond carefully, because we are threatening to play knight to d4 on the next move. A very strong idea. The best way for white to prevent this is by defending the d4 square with either knight to e2 or pawn to c3. This opening is by no means just a beginner-level idea. In fact, even top grandmasters like Hikaru Nakamura and world champion Magnus Carlsen have played this line as white. However, lower-rated players might look for quick tricks and traps to try to win fast. So before we look at the 2 main defensive options, let's first explore a trap that white might try. Let's say white plays pawn to g4. We'll call this cheap trick line number 1. The idea behind this move is simple. White wants to play pawn to g5 and attack our knight on f6. If we respond casually with a move like bishop to g7, white pushes pawn to g5, attacking our knight. If we move the knight away, white captures our pawn on f7 with the queen, and that is checkmate. So we need to be very cautious of this idea. Fortunately, this pawn to g4 move is not sound, and we can actually launch a powerful counterattack. Here we play knight to d4. This move attacks the queen, and at the same time, we are threatening to capture the pawn on c2 on the next move, which would fork the king and rook, just as we discussed earlier. Don't worry, white has no real threats in this position. The queen cannot capture the knight on f6 because our knight is defended by our own queen. Now, white must respond to the threat of knight captures pawn on c2, which would fork the king and rook. To stop this, white might play either queen to d3 or queen to d1. If white plays queen to d3, we can simply capture the pawn on g4 with our knight, gaining material and keeping the pressure on. But let's say white retreats with queen to d1, defending the pawn on c2. At this point, we could choose to capture the pawn on e4, but since this video is all about punishing our opponent aggressively, we go for a more powerful idea, pawn to d5. This is a very aggressive and purposeful move. The idea behind pawn to d5 is to attack white's bishop, gaining a tempo. If white captures our pawn, we then open up the diagonal for our bishop to capture the pawn on g4. Once we play bishop takes pawn on g4, we are threatening the queen, and white must now deal with that. White has three main options to block or defend: knight to e2, bishop to e2, or pawn to f3, which blocks our bishop and also threatens to capture it. Let's first take a look at what happens if white plays knight to e2. This is actually a blunder, because now we have checkmate in two moves. We play knight to f3 with check. The king is forced to move to f1, and we finish the game with a beautiful bishop to h3 checkmate, delivering mate using just the knight and the bishop. So since white cannot successfully defend using the knight, let's explore what happens if white tries to block our bishop using the bishop instead. In this case, we simply capture the bishop first, because our own bishop is under attack. After we trade bishops, white will likely recapture with the knight. Now, we play a very strong move. Queen takes pawn on d5. This move accomplishes two things. Our queen attacks the rook on h1, and we are also threatening a deadly knight to f3 check on the very next move. Now let's go back to the previous position and examine the third defensive option for white, pawn to f3. This move blocks our bishop and also threatens to capture it on the next move. But we do not need to panic. We do not retreat our bishop. Instead, we go for a bold and punishing move, knight to e4. At first glance, this might look like a blunder. It seems as though we're placing our knight right in front of white's pawn on f3, just asking to be captured. Not only that, we still haven't moved our bishop out of danger. But if you look closely, you'll see the trap. White cannot capture our knight with the pawn because the queen is pinned. The real point of this knight to e4 move is that we are clearing the way for our queen to enter the attack. On the next move, we can play queen to h4 with check and follow it up with checkmate, completely overwhelming white's position. If white captures our bishop with the pawn, we play queen to h4 check, and it's checkmate next move with queen to f2. The key to beating the scholar's mate is to stay calm but aggressive. Your opponent is trying a cheap trick, so punish it hard with precise and attacking moves. We've already seen how to handle pawn to g4. Now let's cover white's final try. Queen to b3, creating pressure on f7 with the queen and bishop. But here's the catch. White's bishop is blocking the queen, so even if they play queen takes f7, it's not checkmate. Our king can escape. The best response? Knight to d4, cutting off white's attack and seizing the initiative. Again, we play knight to d4, hitting the queen and threatening the pawn on c2. If white captures our pawn on f7, it looks scary, but it's actually bad for white. We calmly play king to e7. At first it seems risky, but take a closer look. The white queen is under attack from our knight, and must stay on the diagonal to defend the bishop on f7. If white tries queen to b4 check, we simply capture the bishop. So the only real try is queen to c4, still defending. Now we strike with pawn to d5, attacking the queen and trying to deflect it away. White has no good squares left on the diagonal to defend the bishop. If white plays queen to c5 check, we just take the bishop on f7. We're already up a piece, and our bishop now hits the queen again. And if white plays queen takes pawn on e5, trying to grab material, we respond with knight takes c2, checking the king and forking the rook on a1. This is how you punish cheap tricks. Just defend the f7 square, stay calm, and counterattack with precision.